You're listening to the Voice of Russia from the heart of London. On weekdays, we broadcast live from 3 p.m. until 7. We'll bring you news, current affairs, features and debate. You can listen to us on digital radio and online. Visit ruvr.co.uk.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Vivienne Nunis, and today we're discussing the diplomatic spat surrounding Julian Assange. Unless you've been away on a desert island lately, you'd know the Australian founder of WikiLeaks has sparked a bitter row between the UK and Ecuador. The South American country has granted Assange asylum, but Britain says it won't give the 41-year-old safe passage to an airport. The UK says it must fulfil an extradition request issued by Sweden, where authorities want to question Assange over allegations of sexual assault. Bilateral relations worsened a few days ago when Britain sent a letter to authorities in Quito citing a law that they say allows them to enter the Ecuadorian embassy and arrest Assange if they choose. That raised the ire of Ecuador, who saw the letter as a threat. Now the Union of South American Nations has joined with Quito, pledging support in the face of what it calls the threat of violation. Many countries, including Russia, have criticised Britain, saying a British arrest inside the embassy would contravene the Vienna Convention. To discuss the ever more curious case of Julian Assange and the diplomatic ramifications, I'm joined in the studio by Charles Crawford, a former British ambassador in Sarajevo, Belgrade and Warsaw, and he consults on negotiation techniques. Carl Gardner is also joining me in the studio. He's a former government lawyer and a legal commentator. On the phone, we're joined by Annie Machon, a former intelligence officer for MI5 who blew the whistle about alleged criminality in the offices. Annie joins us from Germany. Thanks to each of you for joining me for this discussion today.
This is the Voice of Russia.
First of all, I'd like to ask each of you, was Britain right to send that letter to Ecuador, citing the 1987 Diplomatic and Consular Premises Act as a possible legal basis for entering the Ecuadorian embassy and arresting Julian Assange? Carl Gardner, as a former government lawyer, was Britain right to cite this law?
Well, I'd be quite slow to criticise British diplomats here. It seems to me that the British were completely entitled to tell the Ecuadorians what the legal position is in Britain. No reason why everything they say to them has to be mildness itself. And it seems to me that the threat was vastly overdone, actually, by the Ecuadorians. There was no threat to storm. There was a threat to do something that was a much slower process. And it was clear from the aid memoir that was leaked that Britain was thinking of this as a last resort and would be slow to move to it. So I don't really see what the big problem was.
What about you, Charles Crawford? Do you think Britain was right to cite this law and suggest that perhaps if they wanted to, they could enter the embassy and arrest Julian Assange in what is generally considered diplomatic territory?
Well, perhaps it might surprise you, as a former diplomat, I might be a little more critical of this exercise than Carl just was. Not because I disagree with him on the substance, but the issue really is, was it a good move? I think it's really difficult for people to understand some of the finer points of this in diplomatic terms, because if you don't understand that, you don't quite get a sense of what's going on. There wasn't a letter sent. We did not write a letter to the Ecuadorians. What happened was our diplomat went in there and handed over a thing called a speaking note, which were the notes he was given, he was sent by the Foreign Office to use. He would have had some discretion as to whether or not he actually passed over this piece of paper anyway, within the way our system works. Anyway, the effect of it was there was this so-called threat in this speaking note. What the British were trying to do was head off the Ecuadorians from their announcement that Mr. Assange was going to get this category of diplomatic asylum. They hoped that by making this sort of veiled reference to this law, that might give them pause for thought and mean the negotiations would continue. That just backfired. So my sense is that they didn't quite get the judgment right. That's not to say they necessarily were stupid. It's just that the way it was calculated didn't turn out necessarily the way they planned. Has it made a big difference? No, not really, because we don't recognise that category of diplomatic asylum under international law, nor do most countries, including Russia for that matter.
What about the argument, though, that this move is in direct contravention of the Vienna Convention?
The diplomatic convention, the Vienna Convention, which regulates diplomatic activity, is all about good manners when it comes down to it. It's all about the arrangements under which a diplomat is the guest in your house. And this goes right back to relationships between kings and queens 600, 700, 800 years ago. Now, one of the sense of the convention is if you are a guest in my house, you should not do something outrageous. For example, you should not shoot out of the window of your embassy at police people, which happened 50 yards away in this square in London when the Libyans murdered a British policewoman back in 1986 or so. If that happens, you are in such gross breach of good manners that we are entitled to enter your embassy and take away your weapons. That's what that law says. That is a common sense proposition, but I would suggest it should only be used in situations where there is a gross breach of diplomatic behaviour. And the problem in this case seems to me that by virtue of taking in Assange and, frankly, being a bit of a nuisance, the Ecuadorians had not reached that threshold. And there was no chance of them reaching a threshold, therefore the threat was sort of, in a sense, perhaps disproportionate. But it was a perfectly legitimate thing to say.
Annie Machon, do you agree this was a legitimate move by Britain?
Well, let's not forget that the Diplomatic and Consular Premises Act was brought in after 1987, precisely because of that incident when there was a shooting from the Libyan embassy in London which killed WPC Yvonne Fletcher. And the suspicions, nobody's ever been held to justice for this murder yet, but the suspicions were that it was a Libyan diplomat who fired the fatal shot. And yet, at that point, all the diplomats were still ultimately protected under their diplomatic status and allowed to leave the embassy and be expelled from the UK without suffering any legal penalties. But looking at the sort of conventions around diplomacy and the territory of an embassy and everything, I do find it quite ironic that, rightly, yes, these laws have been in place for hundreds of years now, precisely to protect diplomats who might have to pass on unpalatable messages to the governments or the monarchs of the old countries. So these diplomatic conventions were put in place to avoid the messenger being shot. And yet now, of course, what we're looking at is a number of state governments precisely trying to use whatever law they can to shoot the very modern messenger of whistleblowers, which is WikiLeaks. So it's quite ironic that we're in this situation where a diplomatic embassy can be threatened under what is quite a sort of minor law, and they would breach all these sort of diplomatic conventions purely to get the messenger who has come out with some unpalatable messages.
What about the fact that Julian Assange has been granted what's called diplomatic asylum, which you raised earlier, Charles Crawford? What is this concept of diplomatic asylum, and is it recognised by everyone? Do you agree that it does exist and Britain should recognise it?
Well, I think we shouldn't recognise it because I think basically it's stupid. What happens if you want to run away from a jurisdiction? If, say, you want to seek political asylum, you're in a terrible country, you run away to another country, you then seek political asylum there. There's a Belarusian blogger or writer or someone who's actually holed up in Ecuador facing extradition back to Belarus because he sought political asylum in Ecuador, or the Belarusians want him. Okay. If you have a situation where you can run into an embassy and seek asylum, you end up in the situation you've got now, namely, you've got the status of an asylum person, but you're marooned inside the country you're trying to run away from, which basically creates the mess we're seeing now, which is why most countries in the world don't want embassies in their capitals to become a place where criminals and all sorts of strange people run away every time they're wanted. Some countries have recognised the category of diplomatic asylum, and they're mainly in Latin America, and Ecuador's one of them. So that's why this concept exists. They have a situation that among themselves, if someone runs into their embassy, that person, and is given asylum, you don't have to give asylum to people who run into embassies. If they run into the embassy and are given asylum, that person then under the treaty is guaranteed safe passage out of the country. Most countries in the world think they don't want embassies in their own countries and their own embassies to have to put up with this nonsense. So they don't accept that as a category.
Carl?
Charles is quite right. This is something that seems to be a tradition in Latin America, and there is a treaty from the Organisation of American States, I think, where quite a number of Latin American countries are signed up to do this. Interestingly, asylum is sometimes sought in embassies in Quito, the capital of Ecuador. One of the publishers of a newspaper called El Universo, Carlos Perez Barriga, earlier this year sought asylum in the Panamanian embassy in Quito. He'd been sentenced to 3 years imprisonment and millions of pounds of fines for allowing a column to be run in that newspaper that criticised President Rafael Korea. Eventually, he was given safe passage to Panama. So perhaps the Ecuadorians are much more used to these kind of negotiations than the British. But there's no legal reason why Britain needs to give Julian Assange safe passage just because he's been granted diplomatic asylum by Ecuador.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London, where today we're discussing the diplomatic row embroiling Julian Assange. I'm joined by Charles Crawford, a former British ambassador and a consultant in negotiation, Carl Gardner, a legal commentator and former government lawyer, and Annie Machon, a former MI5 intelligence officer and whistleblower. Of course, Britain says the reason it wants to arrest Julian Assange or stop him going to Ecuador is because it needs to fulfil its international obligations to extradite him to Sweden. Julian Assange faces 2 allegations of sexual misconduct in Sweden, and the Swedish authorities want to question him, although no charges have been laid. Julian Assange says he wants to avoid going to Sweden because once there, he believes authorities will extradite him onto the United States. Now, he says that's because of his work for WikiLeaks, the organisation he founded, which in 2010 leaked 250,000 diplomatic cables from the US, which greatly embarrassed Washington. He says the United States is engaging in a witch hunt against WikiLeaks, and he could be charged with treason with a possible sentence of the death penalty. Annie Machon, what do you think? Do you believe that his fears are warranted?
I do think his fears are warranted. It's an open secret now that there has been a grand jury looking to indict him. It was convened in Virginia at the end of 2010. The terms under which they want to indict him are still held secret. But there's no doubt that exists, that indictment exists. And indeed, the Americans have been in contact with Sweden and the UK and Australia, working out how they can get their hands on him. And I think he would be much more at risk of extradition from Sweden than he is even from the UK, even though the UK has this terribly unilateral extradition act with America. If he were to go to Sweden just for questioning, and he would be arrested and held in solitary confinement, the Swedes, under a bilateral agreement with the US, can temporarily surrender him to the US for processing legally in the US, and only after that's finished, which could go on for decades, would he be then sent back to Sweden to face investigation into these alleged sexual misconduct charges. So we have a situation now where I think he is rightly assessing that if he goes to Sweden, there's a very good chance he'd be imprisoned and then put on a plane as he's temporarily surrendered to go to the States for this indictment. And it's crazy as well that in the US they're now looking at possibility of trying to prosecute him under the Espionage Act, even though he's an Australian. And I do find it very worrying, particularly in the US, that some of the major news outlets are saying this isn't a problem, because he's either a source or he's just published some of these issues, some of these cables and things, when they've done precisely the same thing. And they don't seem to see that if he were allowed to be taken to the US and prosecuted and all his First Amendment rights, all the basic rights taken away from him, that he would be a first case which could lead to the prosecution of other major media outlets in the US. And I just find it astonishing that they're not putting up more of a fight.
Carl Gardner, you were shaking your head there. Do you not believe then that the US is preparing this secret grand jury, or that Sweden would extradite him to the United States?
Oh, I dare say there's a grand jury. I don't know whether there's an indictment yet. But what I'm doubtful about, first of all, the death penalty. It's absolutely unclear to me what United States offence anybody suggests Julian Assange could be charged with that carries the death penalty. I know that Bradley Manning is facing treason charges that carry that. Well, that's because he's a United States citizen. None of the offences I think that could apply to Julian Assange carry that penalty. As far as extradition is concerned, if Julian Assange were surrendered to Sweden, then certainly before the prosecution is completed in Sweden, any further extradition to the United States would need British consent as well as Swedish under the European arrest warrant European legislation. If there were an extradition request to Britain, he could be extradited from here. I think he would be safer in Sweden, and so I don't understand this argument at all.
Do we think then that Julian Assange is simply trying to avoid the investigation in Sweden relating to the 2 allegations of sexual assault, and has sort of created this larger story of WikiLeaks and persecution as a way of avoiding that altogether? Annie Machon?
I think there's a lot of evidence to show that the whole process has been politicised in Sweden, and also that Julian Assange did spend a number of weeks in Sweden waiting to be questioned for a second time. He's already been questioned once, and that, of course, was leaked to the Swedish media as well. He stayed for 5 weeks in Sweden, waiting to be questioned again about this case. and then asked for permission to leave Sweden to go to the UK in late 2010. And he was given that permission by Marion Nye, the prosecutor, who then issued the arrest warrant for him as if he'd fled the country. So there's a lot of misinformation swirling around. But I do take issue about the extradition to the US, because if you look at the terms of the European arrest warrant, sure, it would be necessary to have permission from the UK and also from Sweden to send him off to the US. However, because of this bilateral agreement between Sweden and the US, that is not necessary for the terms of a temporary surrender, and that is what he and his legal team fear if he gets immured in Sweden. So I think it's slightly disingenuous to say, well, his rights will be protected under the European arrest warrant. They won't be with this bilateral agreement.
Carl Gardner, you wanted to jump in there.
I don't understand on what basis Annie thinks that overrides the European arrest warrant system. It doesn't.
Well, this came from advice from Geoffrey Robertson, QC, who looked into the 1984 Bilateral Extradition Act that was signed between Sweden and the US.
Well, he and I disagree then.
Going back to the broader diplomatic spat between the UK and Ecuador now, do we think this case has damaged bilateral relations between the two countries beyond repair?
No, of course not, because these things come and go. I mean, the whole point of diplomatic relations is you have diplomatic relations partly to deal with disagreements like this, and for most of the last goodness knows how many years, relations with Ecuador and the UK have been very tranquil and friendly and sensible. And these things comes up and there's a spat. It may go on for a few months, it may go on for a few years, but in the great scheme of things, it doesn't matter that much. Normal business is going on with Ecuador. I'm sure there are plenty of other issues we're consulting with Ecuador about. Diplomats are very good at putting things in boxes when they want to be, and I think both sides, whatever they may be saying in public, will be quite happy for diplomatic relations to continue. We haven't broken off diplomatic relations with Ecuador. They haven't broken them off with us. It's just a silly noise, and I think, as diplomats, you've just learned to live with silly noises.
What about the resolution of this case then? How do we think it will end? At the moment, we've got Julian Assange still holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. He's been there for 2 months now. Prior to that, he was under house arrest in Norfolk, where while he was fighting those extradition requests to Sweden. How does anyone see this case resolving? I'll go to you, Carl Gardner.
Well, he certainly wasn't under house arrest. He was on bail. So he was, at liberty.
He was on bail, but he wasn't allowed to leave the house
he certainly
at
was.
night.
Well, there were times when he had to be in that house, but he was not under house arrest.
Was he allowed to leave the house other than to go to the police station and report? Or?
Some times of the day, yeah.
Okay, but every night he was in that house.
So I understand, which is, perfectly normal, quite common. It was not surprising that there were conditions on his bail. We don't know. I suspect that the British government and the police think that time is on their side. Assange is the one who's holed up in the embassy. Ecuador are the ones who have him in their laps and causing a problem. And I guess that the British thinking will be that eventually one of them may crack. Of course, Julian Assange is at the mercy of Ecuador. Charles mentioned that the blogger, I think he's called Alexander Barankov, who has asylum in Ecuador. The German press is reporting that following a trade deal with Belarus, Ecuador has now arrested him. So Julian Assange may not ultimately be as safe in Ecuadorian hands as he thinks.
What about you, Charles Crawford? Who will back down in this diplomatic standoff between Ecuador and the UK?
Well, it's a good question, because I think the part of the skill you bring to these situations as diplomats, and the time has to be right to make it happen, is to find creative ways to allow everyone to back down without anyone being seen to lose. So the Ecuadorians have gone out in a way on a limb. They've taken a pretty strong position, which is that they are, trying to occupy the moral high ground in all this. But the legal sort of position they've got isn't terribly strong. Their rhetorical position, I think, is stronger than their legal position, whereas for us, you might argue it's the other way around, and there are the Swedes, and over there somewhere are the Americans. There's a lot of things sort of burbling around below the surface. Maybe it'll be possible to find a way for the Swedes to get what they want in terms of questioning him over here. I don't see any reason why they shouldn't come and question him over here, but that would make sense only if he then agreed to go to Sweden, if the Swedes then decided there was a serious case to answer. If not something like that, I can't see why we should back down. I can't see why Sweden should back down. If Sweden just said, actually, look, we're fed up with the whole thing, we're going to drop it. For example, if the two women concerned said, we don't want this to go forward anymore, Sweden drops it, we say, fine. As far as I know, he can then walk out of the embassy and then take his chances for the rest of his life anywhere in the world on extradition from the USA. But that issue won't go away for sure, because the scale of the leaks by Bradley Manning picked up by WikiLeaks was really enormous. A young man who I was at college with in the States when I was at college and university in the 70s, Jay Pollard, he spied for the United States for Israel. He's still in prison. He's been in there a very long time because of the volume of material he gave away. No country in the world likes people leaking their secret documents. And I think if you leak it on the scale that happened and you publish them on the scale that happened, that's going to cause a lot of resentment, which is going to go on for a very long time.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Vivienne Nunis, and today we're discussing the case of Julian Assange. I'm joined in the studio by the legal advisor and former government lawyer Carl Gardner and the former diplomat Charles Crawford. On the phone from Germany is the whistleblower and former MI5 officer Annie Machon. Annie Machon, you were a whistleblower. Should the Obama administration do as Julian Assange has requested and end its legal proceedings against WikiLeaks and the alleged leaker of information, Army Private Bradley Manning?
I think they've done a public service. They are exposing the crimes and lies of our governments, and you can't have a healthy democracy unless the populace know what is being done in their name. So, yes, I think that should be recognised. I mean, certainly whistleblowing is not the same thing as betraying your country and selling secrets to an enemy power by any means, which is, what happens to traitors. They go to prison for a very long time. WikiLeaks is effectively a new high-tech version of a publishing house. It's getting information out there that people need to be able to read. So it's a very difficult one, seeing how this can resolve. I would tend to agree that probably the best thing as a first step would be for Sweden to go and interview him in the Ecuadorian embassy and see if they then need to take the case any further. But it's difficult it's difficult to know how much pressure is actually being applied by the US behind the scenes, diplomatically and in other ways, to the UK and Sweden. I think just one final point. It's interesting watching Ecuador take this stand, and I don't think they are out so much on a limb because other Latin American countries are also backing them up on this. And there seems to be a sort of resurgence of pride and a certain feeling of growing power, both economically and politically, down in Latin America at the moment. And we see them asserting themselves against the US on a number of fronts, not least the current war on drugs, for example. So I think it's unlikely that Ecuador will back down because they feel that they're in an increasingly supported position.
Carl Gardner, you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, Annie was saying no doubt WikiLeaks has done some good things, but I think it was absurd for Julian Assange in the statement he made on Sunday to try to turn this into a freedom of expression issue, him against the United States, because it's something, and in particular, the parallel he drew between himself and Pussy Riot, I think was quite absurd. They've been sentenced for what was a protest. And in quite outrageous proceedings where they were held in custody without bail. And in his case, what he's being sought for by Sweden is quite separate from his work in WikiLeaks. Another narrative is that this is not about free expression, but about a rape suspect on the run. It's a perfectly legitimate way of looking at it.
Do you think he's conflating the issue then to confuse people out there?
Well, he may feel it's in his interest to present it that way. He may feel it genuinely as well. I don't dispute that. But what I'm saying is there is another way of looking at this, which is not his.
Just on a point you raised there, Annie Machon, that there is growing support in Ecuador for Julian Assange. There's been quite a lot of scepticism in the British media about Julian Assange's decision to seek asylum in Ecuador. Many commentators say the country doesn't live up to the high standard of human rights and freedoms which Julian Assange has espoused. Is Ecuador's human rights record problematic?
Well, I've already mentioned, sorry Annie, I've already mentioned the plight of Carlos Perez Barriga, who had to seek asylum in Panama for his journalism from Ecuador. Charles has already mentioned Alexander Barankov and his plight in Ecuador. So, I mean, really, I think to think of Ecuador as a paradise of freedom of expression is rather strange.
Charles Crawford, what's your view?
It's difficult to quite put your head around some of the issues here because they are so big. I, as a diplomat, I don't really have a problem with the public's right to know about all sorts of things. I do have a problem with the idea that someone who takes 250,000 or 500,000 diplomatic cables and dumps them out there on the internet, in some sense, is a whistleblower. A whistleblower is someone who says, this is a bad thing that's happened, please, I want to bring this to the public's attention. Simply dumping 500,000 telegrams, which you couldn't possibly have read, out there is in a different category. And I think if we want to live in a world in which governments behave in a civilized way, you've got to have some measured way of looking at these things. I think the trouble with WikiLeaks is that it wasn't measured and it was incompetently run. It's all very well saying they were trying to set themselves up as journalists, but the people who've fallen off WikiLeaks have themselves complained that WikiLeaks completely failed to live up to basic journalistic good manners and sensible standards. So I think the idea that somehow in all this Assange is a hero, I just really don't buy it in the end. I can take the point that governments sometimes cover things up, and I'm sure Ecuador government and other governments, do that. That's partly life. But let's try and not destroy all forms of process just because of the vanity of one or two people.
Annie Machon, what's your response to that point?
Well, I think if diplomats and other government channels are aware that they might be under more scrutiny than they're used to, because of course at the moment they're used to working under very strict secrecy laws, they might actually try and say in public what they also say in private and raise their game a little bit ethically. But going back to the point about Ecuador, the idea that they don't have a particularly good human rights record, well, turn it around. I mean, look at the human rights record of the US at the moment over the last decade since 9/11, where you've had them lying a whole, numbers of countries into terrible wars, which have caused displacement and maiming and killing of millions of innocent people, where they've been involved in extraordinary rendition or kidnapping, whatever you want to call it, and they've been involved in torture. To say and to cast moral judgment or moral aspersions on Ecuador, which is part of a continent that's coming out of a slightly darker phase in its history, where America seems to be sliding into a very dark phase of its current history, I think is slightly tendentious, to be quite frank. And also do take exception to the fact that Julian is trying to claim he's a whistleblower. He's not. He is a publisher of whistleblowing material, which comes from a variety of sources and has done since 2007, not just focusing on the United States, but on mega corporations and various other countries as well. And he's exposed a whole range of crimes and incompetencies and things that are very much in the public interest to know around the world.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for here today. No doubt we'll all be watching how the case of Julian Assange plays out and what possible resolution it comes to. In the last few hours, the Ecuadorian President Rafael Correa has weighed into the debate again. He said the UK would be committing diplomatic suicide if it tried to enter his country's embassy in London. The stalemate looks set to continue for now. In the meantime, I'd like to thank each of my guests for joining me here today. Charles Crawford is a former British ambassador and a specialist in negotiation techniques. Also in the studio was Carl Gardner, a legal commentator and former government lawyer. Annie Machon joined us on the phone from Germany. She's a former MI5 intelligence officer and the author of Spies, Lies and Whistleblowers. Thanks to all of you for your time. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Vivienne Nunis. To hear this discussion again or to hear our latest news coverage, visit our website at ruvr.co.uk. For now, though, stay tuned for the news.
This is The Voice of Russia. The London Bureau of The Voice of Russia is now live on digital radio and online. For news, comment and debate, tune in on weekdays between 3 and 7 p.m.